And also the bathroom, or rather restrooms, are on the main lobby toward the I Street side of the building. And also for those on the internet, we really strongly encourage all that have interest in sending in questions for the Q&A to send them in at your first opportunity so we could have sufficient time to get to your questions. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Bart Cruz. I'm the Research Director at the California Air Resources Board, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's Chairman Lecture Series topic and our two speakers. Under the framework of Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, the Air Resources Board and other California state agencies have adopted many measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors across the economy. While much of our focus is on reducing carbon dioxide, other climate pollutants are important contributors to global warming. The majority of these pollutants are short-lived, remaining in the atmosphere for only a few days to a few decades. So reducing emissions from these sources can quickly lower their atmospheric levels, representing a near-term strategy as we make the transition to a low-carbon future. These short-lived climate pollutants include methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and black carbon, which is the topic of today's lecture. We've adopted at least 10 regulations over the past 5 years to reduce California's methane and hydrofluorocarbon emissions, but we've had a much longer history on black carbon. For the past 45 years, since ARB came into existence, we've controlled black carbon as part of the mix of health-damaging particles that contribute to premature death and lung cancer. For example, new diesel trucks sold today have less than 1% of the black carbon of those sold 45 years ago. Local air pollution districts have reduced agricultural burning by 80 to 90% and are also controlling wood smoke and commercial cooking emissions. We sponsored several research projects to characterize the emissions and impacts of short-lived climate pollutants in California. Today's chairman's lecture is on two of first-in-their-kind studies examining the impact of black carbon on California, and will be presented by Dr. Ron Ramanathan and Dr. Lynn Russell from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. Dr. Ramanathan is a distinguished professor of atmospheric and climate sciences and has been one of the foremost scientists bringing the need for action on short-lived climate pollutants to the attention of policymakers. He discovered the greenhouse effect of chlorofluorocarbons and other man-made trace gases back in the 70s and correctly forecasted that global warming due to carbon dioxide would be detectable by the year 2000. His experimental studies show the impacts of black and brown carbon particles on cloud formation, the Indian monsoon, and melting of the Himalayan and Tibetan glaciers. His research project on controlling short-lived climate pollutants has been endorsed by the United Nations and 12 countries so far, including the United States. He also leads Project Surya, which is controlling black carbon and other climate warming emissions from solid biomass cooking in South Asia and Kenya, and is assessing their effects on public health and the environment. Dr. Ramanathan has been part of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was co-awarded the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, and he is a recipient of many national and international awards. Dr. Russell is a professor of atmospheric chemistry, where she leads the climate sciences curricular group at UC San Diego. Her research is on aerosol particle chemistry, including the formation of particles from both biogenic and combustion processes. She's an expert on measurement and modeling of the chemistry and microphysics of aerosol particles in the atmosphere, in which she was awarded the prestigious Kenneth T. Whitby Prize by the American Association of Aerosol Research in 2003. She's also been honored with Young Investigator Awards with the National Science Foundation, NASA, the Office of Naval Research, and other organizations. Her recent work has continued to characterize atmospheric particles in exotic locations ranging from the Canadian Arctic to Greece and Bakersfield. Her work as part of the CalNex study in 2010 here in California illuminated our understanding of secondary organic aerosols and attributed their formation to specific sources, which is informing our regulatory programs. This is a three-part presentation that will begin with Dr. Ramanathan with a question and answer period following the three presentations. Please join me in welcoming both speakers.
Can you hear me? Good. Thank you, Bart, for this kind introduction. I have led, over the last 30 years, several such multi-institutional studies. But at the end of them, I always had the misfortune of bringing bad news about how polluted the planet is, how the glaciers are going to melt, etc., etc. This is the first time where after such a large-scale study, I have the good fortune to report some good news. So that's basically what this lecture is going to be. So I'm going to give part one, and then Professor Lynn Russell will come in and give part two, and then I'll conclude with the last part of this. And as this study was it's a 3 to 4 year study funded by CARB, and several institutions are involved, and several major principal investigators and scientists and students were involved in the study. So the first thing is, let me just give you a summary, a 2-minute summary of what this entire talk is going to be. We all know that California has been a pioneer in cutting down air pollution. But it turns out it has done an amazing job in cutting down particulate pollution from the transportation sector. Of course, the primary goal was to save thousands of lives and tens of thousands of morbidity from air pollution. And the reason we are focusing on the transportation sector is that it's also a major source of a pollutant, climate warming pollutant called black carbon. We used to call them soot, but the more technical name is black carbon. It turns out about 75 to 80% of the constituent of this PM, or particulate pollution, is black carbon. Research done in the last 10 years has shown this black carbon, because it's such a strong absorber of sunlight, is the second largest global warming agent, pollutant, just next to carbon dioxide. So the good news was, what we found, in the last 20 years, the soot concentration has come down by almost 50% in direct response to regulatory actions. And if you go back in time, the data is not perfect. It shows the reduction starting from late 1960s could be as high as 90%. So we have cut down the so-called second largest global warming agent, so which should have led to offset of the global warming, or cooling if you have. So this study was the first such study which was done large scale, meaning on the entire scale of California. How large was the reduction, how much cooling it has caused, and thus how much have we offset the global warming due to carbon dioxide. That, in a nutshell, is what we're going to talk about. That does not mean you can go to sleep now and wake up when I conclude, but just to get you interested. Okay? So I think we have listed some of the major things. I think just let me say one thing, that the reduction of black carbon and the reduction in warming, which California has done over the last at least 20 years, is equivalent to reducing our carbon dioxide emissions, which is the major culprit for global warming, by somewhere between 5 to 13%. I also have a caveat there. We have to be very careful about comparing CO2 with agents like black carbon, which are short-lived. They stay in the atmosphere only 2 weeks. But carbon dioxide, 20% of the carbon dioxide we put today will stay in the air for 1,000 years. So you have to be careful about comparing the two. So these are the major topics we're going to touch in the report. So I'm basically, and as well as Professor Lynn Russell, we're going to just summarize the report we submitted to CARB, and it's published, and so you can see these topics there. So the first thing is, why California? And basically, this is the place that I know of, and I think many of my colleagues would agree, which has had not only aggressive policies on bringing down air pollution to protect human lives, but it also has the excellent observational network, so that it's like a demonstration, an accountability study. We did this, all these things, reduced emission. Did we see an effect in the atmosphere? Okay, so that's what this is all about. And just for those of you who are not in this field, black carbon, or soot, is a result of incomplete combustion. What that means, you have to remember, unlike carbon dioxide, which is an inevitable consequence of burning fossil fuel, we don't have to release black carbon. Okay? So there are ways to cut it down. That's what California did. It's an aerosol, a particle ranging from tens of nanometers to sometimes as several hundred nanometers. And like I said, it's a major component of PM from the diesel transportation sector. And it's the second largest contributor to global warming. What is important, what I'm not going to touch on, there are tens, if not hundreds of studies in the last 10 years, which are sort of shown with model calculations and observations how the black carbon contributes to melting of the snowpacks, glaciers, and retreat of sea ice, so on and so forth. So the major source of black carbon is the transportation diesel, industries, forest fires, I'm going to talk about that, and residential cooking. You see the women in the Himalayan region of India cooking with biomass. But for us, the transportation sector is one of the major sources of black carbon. So this shows that. This is a CARB data, it's not part of our report. So which shows that transportation is the major dominant source. So that's why it was a sheer case of co-benefits. CARB attempted to cut down the particulate pollution from transportation sector, and it led to a large reduction of black carbon. Okay. And so how did our data start? Remember I said is one of the few places we could have done such a study because it's carefully monitored with some of the excellent measurement techniques. And there are two sets of sites we chose. One is remote sites, not close to major cities, in the outskirts. Those are the black dots. There are not too many of them, but they're sufficient. Then the green triangle is all mainly urban sites. So we'll have a look at both, what happened in remote regions, because what you do in cities would be felt all over because of transport. Just to give you how efficient the transport is, we have done some research to show air pollution or black carbon from China comes across in a matter of 4 to 5 days over the Pacific Ocean. So we have to account for that. That's why we were lucky to have both urban sites and remote sites. So the first thing is I'll start with the statewide black carbon trends in California in the remote sites. These are all annual mean, which is yearly averaged. We also have data month by month and season by season. They show a similar picture. The black curve you see is state averaged. Okay? So you can see that it's going from about 0.45 in the late 1980s in that unit to close to about 0.24, roughly 50% decrease. And you see that it's statewide. And in different parts of the state, it's been the same thing. And there are some very interesting things. Initially, in the late 80s, Northern California seemed to have the largest black carbon. But now, I'm proud to say San Diego has beaten Northern California. We have more black carbon emissions towards the end. And So let's go to, that was the remote sites. So let's go to the urban stations. Okay, this was really done by our collaborator Tom Kerstetter from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. They were part of the team, and these were not the same instruments which was used I showed before. That only started recently. These are called coefficient of Haze. Basically, you collect a filter, and you see how dark the filter gets, and calibrate it with an instrument to relate the color and the thickness of it to black carbon. So these sites went back as early as the 1960s. So if you see, when go back to the 1960s, the reduction is as much as more than 70%. Remember, this data stops at 2000. I'll talk about what happened more recently. So this is again taking all those hundreds of stations, breaking into region by region, and again you see it's sort of statewide. Okay, and again you get different regions that are different, but somewhere it's between 60 to 80%. And this decrease, this was not part of our report. This was provided to us by CARB for this talk. That this decrease is still continuing, okay, up to now. And that's where, if you put this all together, we have not done that, the decrease could be as much as 90%, starting from the late 1960s. So let me then summarize this, the part one, the major finding. So I'm going to talk about detection, then attribution, what caused the decrease, and then what is the impact of this as far as climate change is concerned. Those are the three parts. So I already told you that statewide black carbon concentrations have decreased by about 50%. The second part I'm going to talk about soon, which is fossil fuel and diesel emissions, show a corresponding 50% reduction. Okay? These are the emissions. You have to make a distinction between emissions and the concentration in the air. Okay, that is the attribution. And then this trend extends further back, with the decrease being about 72% from the late 1960 to 2000. And more recent data suggests if we had extended this study to 2010, 2011, that decrease could have been as high as 90%. Okay? And the negative is contributing. So what is the major source of it? So let's move on to the attribution part. And this is again data from CARB, that California's diesel program, the black carbon emission, these are emissions, okay? Elemental carbon emissions, you can see how it has decreased from 1990 with as much as 30,000 tons per year to now, which is about 1 per 10,000, okay, and then it's further decreasing. And so now let's talk about what we have concluded is that the reduction in black carbon we saw in the ambient, both in remote sites and in cities, is due to reduction in black carbon emissions from diesel. So how did we come to that conclusion? So the top one, the black curve, is what I already showed you about the black carbon reduction, California average. And the green is the reduction in the emissions from diesel, sort of roughly corresponds, same 50%. And the total fossil fuel emission source of black carbon. It's an entirely different data set, not part of the CARB data set, that also shows what was the key in this is the bottom panel. There we show, again mainly for the remote sites, the trends in other co-emitted species. Black carbon, by the way, is not the only aerosol particulate there. When you take a filter and measure it, you see what's called OC, organic carbon, sulfates, SO4, nitrates, and then black carbon. The other species did not show the strong negative trend we saw in black carbon. So what does that tell us? You know, you can argue, well, the black carbon reduced because the meteorology changed. Instead of air coming from pollution regions, it came from the ocean, etc. If it was meteorology dominated, you would see similar trends in other pollutants. Okay, so it rules out meteorology as a source. So now let's go back. So this one shows again from the Lawrence Berkeley lab Kersteter's data. Their coefficient of Haze measurements, it shows the dark gray. And then that data has been continued a little bit more with the California EPA data. They're not same what we would call homogeneous data sets, so we are a little bit reluctant to take that trend, but it is consistent with the 90% decrease of the total reduction. What was remarkable, what I found most exciting about this, is that we didn't cut down our black carbon emissions by telling people not to drive or not to run trucks. Our fuel consumption, diesel fuel consumption, increased fivefold. So it was done by cleaning up the fuel, cleaning up the engine, and so that's the remarkable success story here, which hopefully can be replicated in the rest of the world. I'll talk to you about the implication of that. So just to conclude, the part B part, the attribution, black carbon has decreased, even though total fuel consumption has increased. And the black carbon trends in the ambient air are consistent with diesel emission trends. So the lack of similar trends, like I said, indicates negative trends in black carbon is not due to meteorology. And the last one was not due to our study, it was basically from the CARB reports, etc. The cleanup attributed to reduced tailpipe emissions, improved engines, and low sulfur fuel. Okay? The thing here, what came out of this when we found 2-3 years ago, was that the large negative trends in black carbon, which we know is the second largest global warming agent, and the lack of corresponding negative trends in co-emitted species. Why is that such a big deal? Aerosols like sulfates, nitrates, these are the ones which gives the whitish haze, they reflect sunlight and cool. So they didn't change, which means targeting diesel black carbon is one of the potent ways we can slow down global warming. Okay, and I'll show that later. The next part is how much of this black carbon contributed to so-called forcing. So what is forcing? Let me go back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Okay? It acts like a blanket. Just like on a cold winter night, the blanket keeps you warm. Not because it's giving off any heat, it traps your body heat. The trapping of the heat is what is called forcing. Okay? In the case of the greenhouse gases, it traps the body heat. Here the body is the planet Earth. Whereas in the case of black carbon, it traps the sunlight. Per gram is the most potent absorber of sunlight. That's why black carbon is there, the sky gets brownish, blackish. So about 30% of the incoming sunlight is reflected back to space globally. And the black carbon cuts down that reflection to space, and traps more heat, heats the air directly, then transports and treats, warms globally. Okay? So we estimated it 2 ways. One is for models, which is the traditional way most people do. Except in my lab, last 10 years, we have a little bit healthy suspicion and skepticism about models. So we use data, satellite data, aircraft observations, and ground network. So we synthesize that forcing, and then so we know how much black carbon is adding energy to California. And then we look at the trends to see how has the effect of the cooling effect. So, you know, what we call black carbon, etc. It's not mystery in the sky when you look at it, particularly when you look at the level of the cloud, when you're flying in is the best way to see it. You will see when it's about a kilometer away from the ground before landing, you'll see a brownish haze. This is something in my backyard, San Diego. We used to think of this brown color as so-called brown cloud. Remember the Denver brown cloud? It's mainly, initially chemists used to think it's NOx. Then we did a major experiment in the Indian Ocean to show the brown colors coming from black carbon. But now it looks like there's another thing called brown carbon. These are basically organic aerosols, which we used to think as mainly cooling. The reason is that, remember when you have forest fires, after the flaming stage is gone, when you have an ember, you see whitish smoke coming out. So we used to think it's mainly reflecting sunlight. But it turns out it's not as white as our eye sees it to be. It has got strong absorption. Okay? So that was, although not we targeted it, it was one of the side results which came out of our study, is that the brown carbon, so let's make a distinction. Black carbon comes out as solid aerosol out of the flame. Brown carbon comes more as also either as gases and then gets converted to particles. I think Professor Russell will talk about it. And it also comes as primary aerosol, the stuff you see in smoke after the fire is gone. And two groups, the UCS group and the Berkeley group, we did independently. We looked at satellite measurements, we looked at surface measurements looking at the sun, and this is kind of technical for those of you not in business. The vertical axis is, think of it as, we call them absorption optical depth. And very few other than my students even know what this means. But think of it as per fractional absorption of sunlight. We have taken the ratio of the absorption by brown carbon to brown elemental carbon. And you see that at wavelengths, you see the 450 to about 600 is the wavelength you see with your eye. 800 to 1000 is in the far, in the infrared. So you see that the brown carbon absorption increases tremendously as you go from longer wavelengths, infrared, to shorter wavelengths. Okay? And the models, in the models, most models, that number would be 0. We are finding it could be as large as 0.1 to 0.4. And the Berkeley study shows the same thing. It's a little bit more complicated. They did it looking at wood smoke in the San Luis Obispo region. The green curve is the incident sunlight, okay, peaks around visible wavelengths. They also showed the fraction of absorption from organic carbon to elemental carbon, the same thing what I showed from our study, and their numbers is similar, okay, around 800 nanometers. It starts close to about 0 and then takes off to 0.5. 50% of the sunlight absorbed in the ultraviolet, about 350 wavelength, is coming from brown carbon. Okay? So why is this important for California? I'll talk about it. Forest fires produce copious amount of this brown carbon. And so this is the source identification where it came from. This came from my colleague. She was one of the principal investigators, Professor Kim Prather, with her time of flight mass spectrometer. And so this comes from limited field studies. And I think the main signal from here is going from Southern California. Our black carbon is dominated by fossil fuels, and go to Northern California, biomass plays much larger role. Biomass burning here could be open agriculture burning, forest fires, what have you. So now let me take all that information and talk about what does it mean to climate change. Okay? So I'm first going to a little bit rely on studies which are published outside of this CARB report. This was the study we published in Nature Geoscience 5 years ago. Don't focus on all the bars, it's not that important. The energy added by black carbon globally. Okay? We estimate it to be 0.9 watts per square meter. Watt is the unit of energy when we say 60-watt light bulb, that is. And the m minus 2 is per square meter of the Earth's surface. This is the metric we use. Compare that to the global warming energy added. This is the blanket thickening, 1.7. So black carbon is almost half as much in terms of the heat added. But it's not that straightforward, because the same source which emits black carbon also emits other species, organics, sulfates, so we need to look at the whole picture. But when we published this, scientists were very skeptical, because the models were giving 1/3 of this value instead of 0.9, about 0.3. So there's a big study started. Over 30 of the modeling groups were convened under this scientist Tammy Bond, done some seminal work on looking at emission inventories. They started out very skeptical of our results, and they found out finally, after they corrected all of the problems with models, they were within few percent of our value. This study shows the fractional absorption of sunlight by black carbon. The top one shows where were the models before they started this study, and the bottom one after they adjusted using the same observation we had. They concluded the model was underestimating by a factor of 3. They redid their calculations, so they came with the number, the total energy added by black carbon trapped is 0.88 watts per meter squared, within 2 decimal places of 0.9. I think they couldn't bring themselves to round it off to 0.9. Then they had to admit we agree exactly with Ramanathan's value. So there is a small difference. I'll work on them to fix the second decimal place. But the jokes apart, we in the community have now finally come to this, that black carbon is a major global warming pollutant. Okay? So now go back to the CARB study. We estimated this forcing using observations of black carbon concentrations, using observations of ground network, and we brought in the satellite. Then we compared it with the model, which also used set of observations. And you see the top of the atmosphere over California. Southern California is about 1.5 watts per meter squared. Remember, in these units, the way we can only have a metric for this is the CO2 was 1.7. But don't let that fool you, because that's 1.7 globally, every place, whereas black carbon is concentrated over sources. Still, it's a metric to compare. So it's a large number. Then we show how much it heats the air. And because it intercepts sunlight, it cuts down sunlight going to the ground. Remember, when you have haze, the ground is dimmer. Okay? What that means is that if we had similar observations in the 1960s, which we don't have satellites, the heating by black carbon would have been a factor of 4 larger. Okay? And then we ran the models to confirm it. So here I show the same thing which Bond et al. Found. On the red circle is the forcing B retrieve, forcing or added heat by black carbon. And the right-hand side, red circle, is by models. We, as part of this team, we recruited one of the top modeling groups run by DOE, Department of Energy Lab. And so their number was off by a factor of 2 to 2.5. Same thing what Bond found globally. We don't know the reason for this yet. Is it in the emission inventory, or is something the model does? And so that's still the models are looking into. Right now what they've done is just adjusted the forcing. They know they're off, so they sort of scale it back. And then now comes the organic carbon. Since organic carbon is co-emitted with black carbon, the thinking was the cooling by organic carbon balances out about 1/3 of the warming by black carbon. What we found in this study, not going through these numbers blow by blow, is that the blue is what the models would say. Like, see the large cooling of about -0.3 watts per. But when we add the brown carbon, that cooling almost comes down to close to zero. In other words, the brown carbon in fires is having a major heating effect. Okay? So the brown carbon and the black carbon working together. What we don't know is what exactly in that organics is doing that absorption. That's something Professor Russell would talk about. So this is the showing of the regional forcing. We saw that this is the current forcing as we obtained from the satellite and ground-based data. I'm not going to touch too much on this, except to point out all these numbers would have been a factor of 4 larger in the 1960s. But the 1960s, the last thing in our mind was global warming, so we didn't have any of these kind of measurements. So now you can ask, well, California has cut down its black carbon. Do we see the effect? Do we see a cooling? Okay. The first thing you have to remember is the greenhouse gases are increasing. Second thing is, when you cut down black carbon, our concentration will come down. That's the beauty of it. It's short-lived. But the effects of this would be felt everywhere, because the air transports. So you put black carbon, it adds the energy to the air, the wind comes and takes it around. So you're not going to see, and that is why this was the study from Bond et al., and we have done this. The black carbon mainly leads to a warming of the extratropics and polar regions. Okay, the heat is transported, so now people are attributing a third of the Arctic sea ice retreat to black carbon. So the effect would be felt. We have not done such a study. What is the effect of California's reduction to global temperature? What we did was locally. And so this is the model simulation, just focusing on the bottom left. It shows how much energy added has been reduced. Okay, that is so-called, think of it as a cooling effect. And you see the blue regions. It shows in the 1960s, California absorbed somewhere between 5 to 10 watts more sunlight than it is now. The sunlight, instead of getting trapped in the air, is going to the surface, and that's where we need. We need sunlight for photosynthesis, for evaporating water vapor, etc. But beyond that, it's difficult for us to say locally, because we need to connect it with the rest of the US. So now I leave it there at that stage. I'm going to pick up the implications. So Professor Russell would do part 2.
So as Ram mentioned, the direct forcing of black carbon has been well understood and well researched as part of the contract he talked about. But my job was to show that that result held even if our atmosphere had not only sunny days, which is what we mean by direct forcing, but also cloudy days. And so this was to focus on the effect of black carbon on cloud interactions. And so in my part of the talk, I'll talk about the importance of aerosol cloud interactions in climate, the conflicting and very controversial results that global climate models had about the role of black carbon in clouds, which motivated the need for this additional study, and how our results explain this discrepancy in the global climate model publications. And in particular, we focused on California to look at the extent to which clouds may offset already some of the black carbon warming, and we actually showed that that's a small effect. And so while there is still a large uncertainty in the size and composition of absorbing particles, we've made progress in showing that the warming effect will still hold. So why do we have to worry about clouds? Well, you can find California on this map and see that we are very close to one of the regions with the highest frequency of what we call daytime stratocumulus cloud amount, and what that means to you is just the low-lying clouds that you see very frequently off the shore of California, both off of San Francisco as well as all the way down to San Diego. This is a very important meteorological feature of the planet because clouds are white, they reflect sunlight. And so that's why clouds are important. They reflect about they contribute to reflecting about a third of the incoming sunlight, and that's important in maintaining the Earth's surface temperature. So why do particles matter? And then we'll think about why black carbon in particular matters. So how aerosols interact with clouds is shown in this simple cartoon. Oopsie. And emissions we describe in plots like this, where I'm showing the number of particles as a function of size in micrometers on the bottom. And so emissions are generally less. Most of the number of emissions are less than a micron in size. You typically have a lot of emissions around 0.1 micron. When a cloud forms, that's when water has supersaturated, either because of cooling or evaporation of water into the atmosphere, or both of those, and the air parcel rises from convection, and as it rises in the atmosphere, if the arrow will come back for me, there we go, as the parcel of air rises in the atmosphere and the particles come with it, when it gets to the point where the cloud forms, some of those particles will grow from small, where they're invisible, into large, about 20 microns in size, where they're very visible. They're the white clouds that you see. Those particles often re-evaporate. Why does this matter for the forcing that Ron often talked about? Well, it's because just like clouds reflect sunlight, whiter clouds actually reflect more sunlight. And so when you add more particles to clouds, in going from less polluted to more polluted, the clouds get whiter because you're actually changing the size of the droplets. And what Toomey showed back in 1974 is that this effect is actually fairly directly related to the number of droplets is what's controlling the amount of light reflected. And so it's a well understood principle, but where he was able to ignore a couple of key terms, in model results, it turns out that it's still very controversial. Here is one modeling results showing where clouds are important. And this is, in this map, we can focus here again in the eastern Pacific off of California. The white area shows where clouds are. The black hatches show where the cooling effect from particle pollution on clouds is more than 5 watts per meter squared. And so this is an important part of calculating global climate conditions, but it actually turns out that this is very controversial. How controversial? Well, 2 studies published in the same years by 2 of the best known groups in this field, Mark Jacobson at Stanford and the Caltech group of John Seinfeld, found nearly opposite results. The Jacobson group found that black carbon actually, when you reduced black carbon from emission control, you actually increased cloud droplets, enhancing black carbon warming, so that drops increased by 14%, and the warming reduced by 15 to 17%. On the other hand, the Caltech group found that reduced black carbon decreased cloud drops, offsetting the black carbon warming. And so drops decreased by only about 6%, but this is big enough to matter. And that meant that warming increased rather than decreasing. And so our job was to set out to understand why these simulations disagreed and whether which result was applicable to California and our emissions. And so, but remember, I mentioned earlier, clouds are the most uncertain part about global climate models. So it actually turns out this is a pretty challenging job. In the end, our results explain this discrepancy by showing that the 2 results, the Jacobson one, is correct if the black carbon particles are smaller than 80 nanometers and not mixed with the types of salts that Ramanathan mentioned earlier, including both organic compounds as well as sulfates and nitrates. On the other hand, the Chen scenario is correct if black carbon particles are larger than approximately 80 nanometers and mixed with things that make them bigger. And so for California sources, it actually turns out that most existing measurements indicate that the black carbon containing particles are often larger than 80 nanometers because they are typically mixed, even very shortly after emission, with salts and other organics that are emitted, either co-emitted or emitted nearby. But this is a question that still requires more measurements to reduce these uncertainties and to really understand the chemical and physical character, the size and composition of the black carbon particles. So for California, we've shown that there is a cloud offset to black carbon warming, but it is likely small. And that's because of two reasons, both because of the composition of particles emitted in California, as well as the need to include both the brightening effect that I talked about and another effect known as the semi-direct effect, which also causes a reduction in cloud amount that results effectively in a warming. So further reductions in both black carbon and the brown carbon will also provide a net cooling for the sources here in California. The largest uncertainty is the size and composition of the absorbing particles. So again, it's back to both the size and composition. So the details here turn out to matter. In order to reduce this uncertainty, measurements are needed to characterize both the size distribution, in other words, how many particles of what sizes contain black carbon. And we also need to understand the contribution of brown carbon that Ramanathan mentioned, because that is organic carbon that also absorbs particles, and it's even more uncertain than the black carbon. Key sources of both the black and brown carbon are diesel and off-road vehicles, and those as well as residential and agricultural burning, as well as wildfires. How can we understand how these particles affect clouds? Well, here's results from a study off the shore of California near Monterey, where we actually could see both the composition of the particles below the cloud and then measure in the cloud using aircraft. So this is below the cloud. They're mostly organic particles. And then when you measure in the cloud droplets, they're over here, and green is organic. So what you have below has the same composition as what you have in the cloud droplets. Similarly, with cargo ship emissions, you have high sulfate fuels, and the mixture of organic and sulfate in the particles below the cloud is what you see in the cloud droplets. So what we can see is actually which particles are activating to droplets, and that is what we need to quantify the offset to the warming effect. So how can we identify the role of brown carbon in clouds? Well, first we need better source characterization. We have information about the California sources that suggest that residential burning, agricultural burning, as well as secondary or photochemical formation, as well as possibly fog formation of brown carbon are important. And so how would we go about quantifying the organic mass from these sources? And before I show the next slide, everyone remember everything you ever learned about organic chemistry. Okay. Okay. So this is far too complicated for me to explain in 60 seconds, but basically all this is illustrating is these are the types of sources of organic carbon in the atmosphere. There's a few in the marine organisms. There's a lot in terrestrial vegetation as well as fossil hydrocarbons. And how these get released to the atmosphere varies. Some is from our usage when we burn and use fossil fuels, as well as when we burn charcoal and other things, is taking that terrestrial vegetation, or when we burn wood, what we release into the atmosphere comes out both as vapors here in the middle and as particles. And then some of those vapors can then get converted to what we call secondary particles. And so this is really big and complicated, but the point I want to illustrate is in these boxes on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see little words that relate to the chemical composition of each of those. And so, for example, the top one has alkanes, hydroxyls, and acids. And the only thing I want you to know is that that's different from the ones that come from biomass burning and other brown carbon sources. They contain ethers, ketones, and acids. And so because they have different chemical components, all of which are organic, they can be detected and separated so that we can quantify the organic carbon and trace which actually affect clouds. So with that, I'll hand it back to Dr. Ramanathan.
Thank you, Lynn. So I'm just first summarizing from part one. This is more for the record, so I don't want to repeat this. This is just to remind ourselves. I come from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which has made the most pioneering observations of carbon dioxide, thanks to Dave Keeling. So it's kind of a must for us. We start always with Keeling curve. But the sad story about this is that CO2 is still increasing. Okay, we haven't figured out how to stop it. And the short-lived climate pollutants, at least, why that is so exciting and significant is that California has shown, I think there is one warming pollutant we know how to break down. Okay. So I think I talked about what's called direct forcing, that basically takes the planet with its clouds and clear skies, but we say, let's for time being assume the clouds are not changing. So we calculate the heating for the cloudy planet. But as we heard from Lynn Russell's talk, these particles change cloud properties. Okay, so she looked at the low clouds and said there is an offset, but it's not as large as the direct forcing. The third is the black carbon settles on the snow, darkens the snow, and it contributes to additional warming. There have been studies to show how the black carbon settles on the snowpack cirrus and darkens that. So what we have now done, we have to put it all together. Okay? So we adopted three studies. One is the Jacobson study. He's from Stanford University. In my mind, he has done some of the best aerosol chemistry climate estimates. The second is the study, which I was a vice chair of this. We had an international group published by W. Mount UNEP in 2011. And the third is the Bond et al. In spite of all these complexities, all these studies conclude the direct forcing effect is the largest component, number one. The second, particularly for diesel, since the other co-emitted species is not large, the sum of all these three effects is positive. Okay? So I'm just showing here, I'm not going to go blow by blow. This is the Bond et al. Study. This top figure shows the direct forcing. And then the rest of the bar charts are various ways. Black carbon also goes into high clouds, it burns clouds. It's one of the most insidious components in terms of interfering with climate change. Okay? But you see that the top one dominates, and then when Bond et al. Add up, all the other forcing in fact amplify the direct forcing. Okay? And Jacobson comes to the same conclusion. Here I've shown one component of the diesel. She shows three bar charts, one for on-road and off-road. The top one is the direct forcing. The middle bar is the aerosol cloud interactions, and you see that they add up to 0. So the direct forcing still dominates. we can't extrapolate it to forest fires and others. There, because of organics, aerosols from forest fires can have a huge impact on cloud formation, precipitation, etc. So let's not extrapolate this. I'm restricting my attention to just to diesel. Why so? And this is again an emission inventory which shows various emissions of global. The ratio of black carbon, organic carbon to BC is lowest only for diesel. Diesel puts out mainly black carbon. You can see that the emission in that unit is 0.28 for black carbon. Organic carbon is 4 to 5 times less. But all the other sources, organic carbon either is comparable to elemental carbon or larger. Okay, so diesel black carbon is a dream pollutant for someone like me who's trying to slow down climate change. And this again repeating our curve, I've shown how the black carbon has come down, but the co-emitted species do not show the same negative trend. And it's not a surprise because their emission is much less than black carbon. So what we then do, how do we estimate the climate effects? One have to go back to climate models. I rely on Jacobson's study, who has done these kind of calculations. And what he has shown, if you pick up a time frame is very important, 100 years, say end of the century, removing 1 ton of black carbon from diesel is equivalent to removing about 2,900 to 4,500 tons of carbon dioxide. Given all the caveats about comparing the two, so we use that from Jacobson's. The other models have done, they're within about 20, 30, 40% of this. We estimate, this is the main conclusion from the report, that the reduction in diesel black carbon emissions, which was about 50% from 1989 to 2008, is equivalent to reducing CO2 emissions by 21 million metric tons annually. But we took an ultra conservative estimate. We took the lowest emission factor for diesel and we just included transportation, not farm equipment, ships, road transportation. But when we used the most updated emission factors from CARB, which was arrived at after our study got started, and included all transportation sources, it turns out the equivalent reduction in CO2 emissions could be as large as 50 million metric tons annually. What does this mean, 2150? Okay, so let's have a metric. The California's annual CO2 emissions put out here in California is about 393 million metric tons per year. So the reduction through black carbon is equivalent to 5 to 13%. Okay, which is a good news, but I want to add a caveat. This does not mean we don't have to cut CO2. If we are going to keep the warming under 2 degrees, I don't know how many of you are aware, we have already given up. I don't think we can bring down the global warming. We expect minimum 2 degrees by 2050 to 2070. Okay. That is assuming we are going to cut down the short-lived climate pollutants, assuming we are going to cut CO2 emissions. So we need to do both. So please don't think me or Lynn Russell, we are saying, forget about CO2, just let's work on black carbon. We have lost that luxury. We need to think of, we have 2 knobs. We have to bring both of them down. One is the CO2 knob, the other is the short-lived climate pollutants, of it the black carbon is one, ozone, HFCs, methane. So our overall finding, I already said it many times, so I don't want to repeat it, okay? And is that, you can read that, I will repeat it. These are the trends. And so, but let me just mention this. The large negative trend in black carbon direct radiative forcing and the lack of corresponding negative trends in organic carbon confirm that diesel-related BC emission reduction would lead to global cooling. So you can ask, Why is this so significant? So far, we had known this only from model studies. Okay? Because of the complexity of the particles which we heard from Lynn Russell, we cannot completely rely on model studies. So this is a major thing coming from observations. Okay? And so at least this is one thing, both observations and model studies we agree on. What does that mean? It's ready for prime time in terms of policy changes. Okay? So the other is, more detailed stuff about models. And then let me repeat, the BC reductions we have seen since the 1980s is equivalent to reducing our CO2 emissions by 21 to 50 million tons annually. And these are the recommended future work. Lynn Russell very eloquently already talked about how do we reduce uncertainties in aerosol cloud offsets. I'll tell you, I emphasize this for a different reason than Lynn Russell, is that aerosols impact precipitation, cloud formation, precipitation. There are studies which have shown you pollute the clouds too much, the drops don't become big enough to fall as rain on our head. It just stays there longer. Okay? And we talked about the brown carbon. This has huge significance, particularly to burning. So the one on the bottom is not part of a report as something I would like to see happen. In view of the combined warming effects of brown carbon and black carbon, you've got to evaluate the role of increasing frequency of forest fires. Some claim it's coming from climate change to regional and global climate. We have to throw in the brown carbon and see what is it doing to our climate. So I want to conclude with my personal commentary. I think Lynn Russell didn't object to it, so I can assume that she's with me on this, is that California's successful policies for using BC, and as a scientist I must say it's support of science to evaluate regional climate impact, these are the accountability part, should serve as a knowledge to action example for the world. Okay? And the second one, this is, I have not published this, it's based on my estimates of using my past studies. If California's efforts in reducing black carbon from diesel, I want to qualify that, if it can be replicated globally, we can slow down the projected global warming from now to 2050 by as much as 15%, in addition to saving lives. Thank you, CARB, for finally letting me get some good news out of my research.
Yeah, I'm Bill Dean from Cali, PA. A few years ago, CARB made them switch from high sulfur fuels to low sulfur diesel fuels. What impact did that have on black carbon, brown carbon, and sulfates in the atmosphere?
Yeah, I think so. Let me comment on that, maybe Lynn, but I'm not the expert on this. So I encourage somebody from CARB here to speak up. One of the main sources of reduction for black carbon is that switching from high sulfur to low sulfur diesel, because the downstream things like filters in the cars require that fuel. So I would say it played a major role. I don't know, maybe you can comment on that, or? Okay. You want to comment on that?
Sure. That's the primary answer. I'll also add that you asked about how sulfate has changed. Sulfate, there's every indication that's gone down. Ramanath, from that particular source, but in the meantime, usage and activities, so essentially people and trucking, have increased so that, as Ramanathan showed, the amount of organic and sulfate and nitrate has actually been pretty constant over the last 20 years. So I guess that's a mixed, it's sort of good news in that it could have been worse if we hadn't implemented those policies. So if you guys hadn't implemented those policies.
Hi, this is Tobias Schultz from SCS Global Services. I thought your map of the forcing from black carbon to organic carbon on slide 30, this map, I thought that was pretty remarkable. It shows that even with the reductions we have, there's still this forcing of over 2 watts per meter squared over Southern California, which is pretty remarkable. My question is if you were able to try to link or find out how much of that black carbon that's over California is from overseas sources, because you mentioned that black carbon will transit from Asia, and I wonder how much of that is from those sources that are far away, essentially.
In this study, we have not done that dissection. But going back to an earlier study published, in fact, by my student, Odell Hadley, as part of her thesis, is that we have done aircraft observations from Northern California. And they suggest if you focus above 2 kilometers, about 75% of the black carbon was imported. I don't know if I can use the word imported, from East Asia. Okay? But that pattern you see north-south cannot be blamed because the long-range transport is kind of uniform. So that pattern must come from local different asymmetries in emission between the north and the south. We saw that Southern California is more dominated by fossil fuel, Northern California is more biomass burning. Does that address your question, Tobias? But it does show we still have a long way to go. While we have great success, but we can use that success to even cut down our black carbon even more.
I'll just add that what you can see for observations like the offshore ones that Bram mentioned is that when you go offshore and even to coastal sites, the black carbon is generally much lower and more similar to the types of levels you'd see in the Northern California. But as you get to the more populated areas, you increase by a factor of 2 to 10 locally. So most of that red is going to be from California. The green is arguable.
Sorry, you're looking at a level of half a watt per meter squared, perhaps, from these imported sources. Something in that ballpark?
Although that includes the background as well. But that would be enough of it.
Bob Sawyer, University of California at Berkeley. Very nice work. Thank you so much for presenting it. Do we have an adequate understanding of the fate of the black carbon when you say short-lived, certainly compared to CO2, compared to methane, for example? Do we know what happens to the black carbon?
Sorry, I was reading this question. Could you?
I'll try and answer first, and then you'll have a minute.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question is, how certain is the lifetime of black carbon, or how certain is it that it's short-lived? The things that affect particle lifetime are actually different than what controls methane, in that most of the particles emitted from the source of the planet are rained out is the main way they're removed, rather than being reacted photochemically, which is how you get rid of methane. And so that, to some extent, makes it easier in that limits the lifetime to 3 to 7 days, typically.
That's true, but one thing I would add to that, the term short-lived is kind of a relative term. We should have said shorter-lived, is we are comparing with carbon dioxide. It is focused on climate change, which happens in decade to century time scale. These substances, anything less than 10, 15 years, we call short-lived. So black carbon, people say a few days. I think we should think of few days to few weeks, because it has to be seasonally dependent. When you have dry season, there's nothing to remove, it just stays in the air. So in that sense, it's short-lived compared to the CO2, where we are talking about multiple decades and centuries.
Apparently it's long-lived enough to get to the Arctic sea ice.
That is
Do we understand
And
how
that's
that happens?
Yeah, that's in part due to a quirk of meteorology in that it mostly gets transported up there in the springtime. And the reason that is because springtime in the Arctic is both starting to have less precipitation and you get, it's kind of like the LA basin in that you get stagnant air, so it goes up and has a really long lifetime because there's very little rain and it's trapped there. And so that's, yeah, that's a feature there as well, an unfortunate feature.
There is a question from through the internet, so we should address that. Yeah.
Do you want to take that one first, or?
Okay. It's an easier question, so I want to take this first. It basically says, I'm not going to repeat it word by word, is that if California's black carbon emissions have been reduced so substantially, and since models suggest the black carbon is contributing to glacier melt and snowpack melt, why are we not seeing this in California? Instead, it's increasing. I mean, we are seeing more retreat of the snowpack and glaciers. The answer to that is carbon dioxide. We are still having greenhouse warming. Like I keep pointing out, the CO2 effect is dominant. If the greenhouse gases stopped increasing, then we should have seen that effect, black carbon effect, but it's just being dominated by CO2 and other greenhouse gases. They are still increasing.
Johan Herner with CARB, thank you for a very nice presentation, and thank you for giving us so much credit. In your opinion, what should we do next?
I'll tell you, I'm somebody focused on global climate change. I think that this is something I proposed to your commissioner during a hearing, is that we need to first share our knowledge to the rest of the world to see how much of it can be replicated. I think that's the way we're going to slow down climate change. But I think the next, we still saw our black carbon emissions, and the forcing is still large over California. So we need to now a little bit more look aggressively where else can we reduce our black carbon emissions. So that's something I have to leave to the experts from CARB to address that. We still have some ways to go in cutting down our own black carbon emissions, but the impact on global climate change would come from California partnering with nations like China. It's very nice. Our governor has started a collaborative program, India and Brazil, etc. Because I think what we have shown is that it can be done. And it can be done without telling people you will not drive your cars. So there is a message there. There is a technological solution to this, which is benefiting public health. So our approach should be minimizing public health effects and then show, well, there is a co-benefit to climate change. Lynn, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and in particular, in terms of sharing knowledge, I've been working with our neighbors to the south, Mexico, where I think there is also a potential right at our doorstep to really influence black carbon emissions down there, even just in Tijuana region, which is neighboring us, and will have much more effect on our regional climate as well as our regional air quality. And I'll just underline also that we do need to, even though it's not my research area, keep CO2 on top of the agenda, because that's what has to matter in the long term for the next generations.
Hello, my name is Jin Xu. I'm from Research Division. I have a couple of questions regarding slide 29. The first question is, in this slide you showed that the net radial forcing of organic carbon is negative. So basically saying organic carbon, the net kilometer forcing is negative. But will you be able to separate out the radial forcing due to brown carbon only? Is that a negative or a positive forcing?
That will be positive if you take the difference between the, let me just see, we didn't go card. Yeah, the brown carbon effect is positive. And when we add it with the rest of the organic carbon, you still see, you should see the red one, observationally based, right? It comes out slightly negative. That doesn't mean all organic carbon plus brown carbon will produce negative forcing. We don't understand the source of the brown carbon. I'll tell you why it's a huge deal. If it turns out half of the brown carbon heating we are finding, we are throwing everything into this organic carbon basket, not by source. If it turns out, say, some of the half of the organic carbon, brown carbon heating comes from diesel as secondary aerosols, then the benefit we are talking about diesel would be even larger. But if all of the brown carbon comes from open burning, then it means something else. So we need to, the most urgent thing we need is to understand what exactly do we mean by that brown carbon. Our work is looking at it what we call optically. We are saying how much of the sunlight is absorbed. We have an instrument with a telescope looking at the sun. We know so much is absorbed. Then we remove the black carbon from it and say this is unexplainable, so this has to be from brown carbon. We need now chemists like Lin and others to tell us what exactly is that brown carbon. Is it secondary aerosol from fossil fuel, or is it primary aerosol from biomass burning, etc., etc. We are not ready to say that.
The follow-up question is on, I just wondering, what caused the atmosphere heating in the go-kart modeling if the model treats the organic carbon as low absorption at all?
Right. The go-kart model, I'm not endorsing it, is the only model which comes close to simulating our data. If I plotted the rest of the models, all the models in climate studies, that atmospheric heating would be zero, because they assume organic stores themselves. Go-kart is driven from observations. It uses observed meteorology. It's like a forecast model. So there are many things different from that, and that's why we compared with that model.
Thank you.
But it's not used for climate studies. It's a forecast type model.
Rosto Bresny with the Manufacturers of Emission Controls Association. And I guess I was wondering, in our regulatory policies, we don't recognize black carbon as one of the climate forcing components. And I was wondering, what is really limiting us from being able to incorporate that into our policies?
Thank you for asking that question. I didn't plant that question. About 10 years ago, we persuaded UNEP to start a program called Atmospheric Brown Clouds with the recognition that air pollution and greenhouse gases should all be, including stratospheric ozone dip, should be considered under one basket as far as policy is concerned. We found out now black carbon impacting health, climate change. So we have been wanting to see air pollution agencies take over climate change problem. And again, let me say this, I'm so happy CARB is taking that. and I'm not going to apply for any more CARB funds, so I can now say this, is that EPA is starting to do that slowly. And I was happy to see this afternoon CARB is thinking of the short-lived climate pollution. So we don't have the luxury to think of air pollution is sitting in that box, climate change is sitting in that box. They're all sitting in the same box. And I think once we recognize that, these kind of things won't happen anymore.
So is the problem really? Is there the problem really our ability to agree on what that factor should be? And that's why we haven't done it yet.
We haven't done that. Exactly. Let me just add one example to that. Sorry. For example, sulfate causes cooling. So when we reduce sulfate emissions, which we have to because of its health effects, we are going to increase the warming. Okay, that doesn't mean we stop cutting down sulfates. What we have to know is that, oh, if I'm cutting sulfates, I'm going to increase the warming, so I have to cut something else to offset it. That something else can be black carbon. That something else can be CO2. So that's how the policy would be going in a different direction if you recognize the two.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, maybe we can thank our speakers for a fabulous lecture. And I'm sure we'll stick around a few minutes if you have any one-on-one questions you'd like to ask. But thanks for coming today.
I think so. He was getting worried. I looked at his nervous look.